live here. And there, Kalpana is an attendee. And Sue. And Jessica. To the attendees who've just joined us, we've been having some unexpected technical problems. There's Janice, starting with the internet is down in the Wyndham Chambers community room. We've been scrambling with our backup plan here. So sorry to keep everybody waiting. Janice, we found you here, and hopefully you're on your, there you are on your way into the panelist, and we'll do a sound check on you. I think everybody else could be heard at this point. So why don't you come off mute, Janice?
Good evening.
Good evening.
Now, is it coming, that's coming through your computer, not through the owl? We need to put the owl sound on here. Just when we think we have this down to a science, you know, the gods put us in our place and humble us here.
Somebody say something, if you would.
Janice, say something.
Hello, good evening.
No, that's coming out of your computer.
There we go. Okay.
You got the owl now. And then the mic has to be on the owl as well, which is probably why we were not getting good sound there.
Here's one.
Sound has been better.
Better, thank you. And you sound good. You just came through our owl speakerphone here.
Excellent.
We are not, have not been completely defeated here, Stephen.
Oh, we got there.
Okay, is everybody ready for us to start? All right. Here we go. This is a special meeting of the Needham Housing Authority Board of Commissioners. And I will be starting by calling the roll. So Reg Foster is present.
Eleanor Evans, present.
Ed Scheidler, present.
Penny Kirk, present.
Janice Bennett, present.
Great, and we have our interim executive director and our assistant executive director with us in the room. We have one resident with us here in the room, and we have a number of residents that are attending as attendees here. I just wanted to say for the record that this meeting was duly posted with the town clerk and noticed, and it was last Friday. So that would be the no, it was it was last Friday. And I think we are ready to proceed. Now, we have this special meeting was originally set up to hear from our guests and our Development and Preservation Initiative consultants, the Cambridge Housing Authority, which we'll introduce in a while. But we also had an open item on the executive director search, a placeholder, so that we could give the board a brief update as to what's transpired since the last board meeting in mid-December. At the mid-December meeting, we received the report of the search committee. Thank you very much, Janice, and the people that participated in that, and their recommendation that there were originally there were 3 candidates that they were recommending the board schedule interviews for. And between the time they made the recommendation and the time we had the mid-December board meeting, one of the 3 candidates dropped out and took a position with another housing authority. But we had 2 candidates, and we made the decision and had a placeholder interview session set up in the last week of December. A few days after that, the following week, a couple of days before the Christmas holiday weekend, our search consultant, Rich Lico, reached out to Steve and me and said the second of the three candidates that were recommended had also withdrawn his candidacy. This was the gentleman from New York. And that with only one candidate at this point, he was recommending that we not proceed with the interviews right now, based on his knowledge of how things go with DHCD and improving the executive director candidates. He expressed regret. He sent us an email at the time, which I forwarded to the board earlier this afternoon, which you can read for yourself, but he basically recommended that that we needed to reopen the search, but there was no point trying to do it right away during the holiday period. And he recommended that we give things a rest for a month and then repost the position, re-advertise the position, and hopefully some new candidates will show up. So that's where things stand right now. One other thing transpired then a week later, which is he called and said another candidate had responded, as somebody who had initially inquired but had not been interested, had responded that maybe they might be interested, but they weren't sure, and it was the holiday period and so forth and so on. So there is a potential good quality candidate, according to Rick Lico, but that candidate has not agreed to formally submit their, submit themselves for a consideration. So that is where things stand right now. We checked with Rick, and Rick checked with his candidate this week, and that's still where things stand. So, I wanted to just bring the board up to date on that. Does anybody have any comments with respect to what Rick is recommending that we do here? Go ahead,
Yes,
Ed.
I do. His memo was dated December 21st, and we're
Yes.
not hearing about this until January 5th.
Right.
And I think that's a very disappointing responsibility that was not forwarded to us. And with that thought in mind, I would also like to mention the fact that Mr. Lico was informed a long time ago with copies to our chairman and our interim executive director that we were requesting his communications be directed through the chairman of the search committee. He has refused to do that. And it's very disappointing that both the chairman and the interim executive director did not correct him and ask him to follow our wishes, that his communications be directed through the chairman of the search committee.
All right, well, I accept that criticism. At the time, we were going into the holiday period, and actually I thought of forwarding it, but we had, at the time, at the meeting, we had basically accepted the final report from the search committee, and then we were moving on to board interviews. And right now the search committee isn't actively searching for anything. So I accept that criticism, Ed. Sorry about that. Any other comments?
Well, I move that we reject his suggestion and that we have a candidate that 4 out of the 5 members of the search committee supported. And I move that we make a placeholder for our January regular board meeting to vote on that candidate. Do I have a second?
Second.
Are there any other comments? So I would make the comment, we haven't interviewed that person yet. So you're suggesting in your motion that we, schedule the interview, is that right?
Interview and vote.
Okay.
Second.
This has been dragging on now for quite a while, and I think we need to move
Okay.
forward.
Well,
And you have the support of 4.
Lico's, I'm sorry, go
You
ahead.
have
and
the
finish your
support of
comment.
4 out of the 5 members of the committee who support one candidate. And I don't feel that we need to continue searching. we have a strong
Okay.
candidate that has a lot of support.
Okay, what Mr. Lico also said is that the one candidate we have does not meet the DHCD minimum requirements and will not be
I
accepted by
disagree with that.
DHCD.
She does meet the minimum requirements.
Okay, then obviously this is not on the agenda for discussion, like in terms of establishing that one way or the other. I'm
Not tonight. I'm
I don't
making the
think we'll go
motion
there,
that
but-
we accomplish that
No,
at
no,
next standard board
understand.
meeting.
And I think that what you also, if I may suggest, you mean also that if the question of whether this person does or doesn't meet the minimum requirements be also part of what we consider at our next board meeting. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I'll be very happy to provide my argument, my information, my interpretation to all the members of the board prior to that meeting. As the open meeting law allows, that information can be submitted to the members of the board for interpretation and further discussion at a future meeting.
There is some disagreement about that, but that hasn't stopped you from doing what you just said in the past here. I understand, but one way or the other, we will address that issue at the agenda item that proposed
Okay,
for the
so
next
we have a
board
motion
meeting.
on the floor to do just that. Should we vote on it?
Any other comments from Eleanor or Penny or Janice?
Can you just refresh my memory about what the process is in terms of DHCD approval of candidates? I mean, so is the
Yeah.
process that the board votes on a candidate and then it goes to DHCD, or is there some sort of process before it comes to the board of sending the resumes to DHCD to have them determine whether the people are qualified or not? Or what's the process again?
It is not the latter that you just said. It's we decided to have a search committee to screen the candidates and make recommendations to our board, which happened last month. And then the board receives those recommendations and interviews the one or more finalists. In this case, we have only one finalist at this point. We did have 3 finalists. And then if the board votes to extend an offer of employment to a candidate, then that candidate has to fill out paperwork, sign an employment contract with the terms and conditions of the offer. And the Housing Authority signs that contract as well. But the contract is not effective until it's submitted along with all the justification packet to the DHCD, and then they have up to 60 days to review the information that's submitted and make a decision as to whether to approve it or not. In a nutshell, I mean, I can recirculate the memorandum that went out a few
No, that's
months
fine.
ago.
I just
So
wanted
that's
to.
basically it. So, and they in that in those guidelines and that PHN are a list of minimum criteria that a executive director for a housing authority of our size needs to have, and that was what Ed was saying he thought were met.
But regardless of whatever the board determines, DHCD takes a look for themselves and determines for
That's right.
themselves.
And that person, and the executive director can't start until, as an executive director, until we hear back from DHCD one way or the other. Or let's say hear back with an approval from DHCD, I think would be a more accurate way of putting it here. Okay, so we have a motion.
And Eleanor, if
we-
I could just interject and give you a little bit more detail. In the DHC requirements for executive director, I believe it was distributed to all of the board personnel. And I believe every aspect of the DHCD recommendations has an either or clause for the recommendation and how that recommendation could be fulfilled. So you might want to take a look at that. If you don't have it, maybe Steve could send it to you.
I know, I've seen the DHCD memo before, but I just couldn't remember how it worked.
Yep, there's always an either or clause. There's an either or clause. You might want to,
Well,
But- And I assume that if we're going to be discussing the candidate at the January or the regular meeting, that person's resume would be distributed. And any other data that the committee collected would be distributed to the board.
and we'll it distributed the committee's report, and we'll redistribute everything. And so redistribute the TD guidelines. And of course, if Ed he wants to add to the packet, that can be done as well. So that, yeah, we can do all of that.
I also want to say
Okay,
that I think it's
any
highly
other comments
inappropriate
from board?
that we're discussing this in front of the person that is actually vying for the job. I think it's highly inappropriate. But you should make her come to
Okay.
the meeting.
It is a very strange situation. We're required to discuss this in public like this, and we've talked about for years how difficult it is to comply with the public meeting laws here. And so I agree with you in principle, but have discovered many times over that there's no choice but to do it this way. That includes, salary, compensation, benefits, and everything. Everything has to be done absolutely in the open, in public, in front of everybody in the whole world, and with prescribed tenant interview involvement and so forth and so on. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm going to just comment that I don't think it's advisable to not follow the recommendations of our search consultant. And the reason I think is that this guy is an expert. He's been hired as an expert by us. He's, he was recommended to us by D. And originally is one of the 2 or 3 people, firms, outfits, they thought would be able to do a good job. Now, here we are, many months down the road, and we are in this situation. But I think it's, I don't think we should be substituting our judgment. And if he's telling us that it's not going to get through DHC, we should respect that. But I think Ed is suggesting that we put it formally on the agenda so everybody could be prepared, to discuss this at our next regular board meeting, which is the 19th, I believe, of January. And so that's the motion that's on the floor. Hearing no further discussion, I'm going to call the roll as we have to vote on Ed's motion. Penny Kirk, how do you vote?
Yes.
You're on mute, Penny. No, I was asking for Penny's vote, but let's go the other way around. Ed Scheidler, how do you vote?
I support my motion. Yes. Vote in favor.
Yes. Janice Bennis, how do you vote? I'm giving you
I-
Penny some time to figure out how to come off of mute. Yes, go
can
ahead,
you-
Janice.
Can you repeat the
You support
motion?
it.
Can you repeat the motion?
You want me to
Um,
repeat it?
Yes,
Yes, the motion is
Go
to
ahead.
bring forward the discussion and a vote on our candidate for executive director at the next board meeting, the regular board meeting in January. To bring forth that discussion and a vote on that candidate.
Thank
And
you.
interview, right?
Interview
And
and
interview,
vote.
right? Yeah, interview, discussion, and then vote, I think is what you said the first time around.
Yes,
right?
that's fine.
okay,
This
that
was-
is good
right, so
clarification.
Ed-
Thank you. So my vote is aye.
Okay, and Penny,
Actually, I said aye
Your
before,
vote?
but I was on mute. I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm saying aye.
yes, yes, no. Okay, great. Eleanor,
I,
and I vote nay. So that carried, motion carried 4-1. Okay, well, that was a little longer than I expected. We're now ready to go to the next agenda item, next agenda item for tonight. And I'd like to introduce Margaret Moran from the Cambridge Housing Authority, who has been before us before, and Natalie Jan, and she's the overall project supervisor, Natalie Jansen, our project manager from the Cambridge Housing Authority. Wave at us, Natalie, and Joe D. Lorenz, our deputy or assistant project manager. And have you done screen sharing so that they can use the screen?
Penny has her hand.
Oh, do you have your hand up, Penny?
I
Go
do.
ahead.
Yeah, I would only like to make the comment that the email from Mr. Lecco dated December 21st should have gone to the chairman of the search committee immediately.
Yep, I hear you. That's my fault. I accept responsibility and I accept the criticism. Sorry about that. All right, the floor is yours to the Cambridge Housing Authority here.
Good evening, everyone. Margaret,
Natalie.
I think you're muted, but
Margaret?
okay, perfect. So hello, it's a pleasure to be here again in front of you to discuss repositioning. We have a presentation that we prepared. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And then I just wanted to let everyone know that as we're going through the presentation, some of it will be familiar because it's based on a presentation that we presented back in November, and also some of the trainings that we've done related to repositionings, but it's also a lot of information. So you should feel free to stop and ask questions if any come up. And we can essentially kind of go slide by slide, and take questions so that it's as helpful as possible.
Okay.
Great. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. And it's a PowerPoint presentation, right? Great.
Yes.
I see
Excellent.
my house.
So in terms of the table of contents of what we'll discuss today, so this is related to the kind of narrowing down the final repositioning strategies for the Needham Housing Authority. We're going to do a very quick overview about where we are right now and how we got here. We also have a slide that goes over some of the guiding principles of development that Needham has, which is a great context for evaluating these different repositioning strategy. And then we will focus the third section on 2 final strategies for the Needham Housing Authority that can be evaluated in terms of a number of different items, which are the A to F sections here. And then finally, we'll wrap up the presentation by looking at next steps for the board as it works to make a decision around the future repositioning strategy for Needham. So I'll give a high-level overview of this timeline, but essentially we've been working on this with the Needham Housing Authority. The CHA has been working in the role of development consultants, providing recommendations on how to convert the federal property, the federal portfolio from the Section 9 public housing program to the Section 8 program. So those are Cook, Seabeds, and High Rock Estates, a total of 136 units. So we started off the process by looking at the different repositioning tools that are available through HUD and also the different properties, and provided a training to the NHA board, as well as an initial repositioning report. One of the big steps that was taken in December of 2021 was to get an architectural team on board to create property conditions reports for the 3 federal properties. Since then, we've been working to review the reports that have been created and the findings. And that's pretty much taken us through the end of 2022. As well, a big milestone that was hit in the fall of 2022 was that an architectural and engineering team was selected for the London Chambers redevelopment, BH+A, and they're going to get started now that the contract is almost signed. The kickoff call is next week. And so in December of 2022, at the end of last year, Dietz and Company, the architects that were procured to do the property conditions reports, provided the final reports for Seabeds and Cook, and a second draft for High Rock Estates, which had some additional investigation that was done as part of the reports. So in terms of repositioning, I mentioned it very briefly, but it's essentially taking the federal public housing units and moving them from the Section 9 public housing platform, which has historically been underfunded and provides a low operating subsidy that isn't enough to meet the capital needs at those properties, to a better funded Section 8 platform. A lot of what we're going to go through today are numbers and different eligibility requirements and specific program requirements of the repositioning. So we wanted to essentially start off the presentation by taking a step back and looking at the Needham Housing Authority guiding principles of development that the board voted upon as a way of understanding what the goals are of the housing authority, and also providing a lens of how to think about what the repositioning can do in terms of the additional resources that it provides in order to meet these goals. You are all very familiar with them, so I'll just quickly go through them, but essentially you're looking to preserve and extend the lifetime of the existing portfolio that you have, both public housing and state public housing, for another 40+ years where possible. That entails comprehensive modernization, where it's not possible to preserve those units in that way, redevelop units into communities that either have an equal or greater number of units. Then there's the hope to develop additional new units on underutilized Needham Housing Authority land. As part of this, there will be a proactive resident involvement, as well as a cooperative partnership approach with the town boards. The focus would really be on rental housing units, with a hope to essentially reach households with incomes at 50% of AMI or below. In terms of managing these changes, the Needham Housing Authority wants to retain operating management control and governance control. It wants to address issues around accessibility at the properties. That's both providing a right percentage of ADA units, but also making sure that senior housing developments with 2+ stories have access to elevators. The hope too is to leverage a repositioning like what we'll be talking about today to provide enhanced resident services, and to in your properties and new construction to comply with Green Needham energy requirements.
Should we pause there, Natalie, and just give the board a chance to digest that and see if there's anything overlooked, or whether that still is valid? Because of course, those are very important guiding principles that dictate where we go from here. Does any board members have any comments on what Natalie went through?
I do.
Go ahead, Janice.
Um, going down to the bottom, leverage repositioning to provide enhancement resident services. Does that refer to where residents will reside after, before and during the repositioning process?
Natalie, I think that question is for you.
So my understanding of this is that it would be related to essentially resident services that would be provided to residents, both who are currently living at Needham Housing Authority properties. And if you are relocated during a repositioning, if there is construction work, that you would still have access to these resident services. But my understanding of this bullet point was that it was really related to a desire by the housing authority to essentially continue to provide resident services and expand those where possible, and then using funding that's coming from the properties to be able to fund those resident services.
So it has nothing to do with where the residents are gonna go during the repositioning process. It's
No,
just
so that is as part of if there is any construction work and if relocation is needed, then essentially the Needham Housing Authority would work to put together a tenant relocation plan that would look at what are the different relocation options for residents.
And so I'll pose that question back to you, Reg.
Mm-hmm. Which question is that?
While the repositioning is going forward, will the residents reside?
Okay, so that is to be determined on all of our projects in the next phase. It's a major part of the Linden Chambers phase. We're going in with the new A&E Designer Services team that we've hired. And when we get to there's two ways of sort of responding to your question. The repositioning is really the process of moving ourselves from the Section 9 funding stream, which is not as robust, to the Section 8 funding stream. So that's something that we'll get into in just a minute. And then and we have our property conditions reports that have been completed that say we should be putting 10 million, I'm just doing rough round numbers, $10 million worth of investment in both seabeds and $10 million in Cook. And then once we've designed those upgrades and renovations, there has to be a plan at the same time as we're designing it that says, okay, if we're going to do one floor at a time in seabeds, let's say, of the 5 buildings, where does the 8 people that live on that floor temporarily reside for the 2-week period or the 4-week period or whatever, when their kitchens are being redone? So that's work to be figured out. And as I understand it, back to Natalie and Margaret, when we get there, it's mandated that we have tenant input into how that temporary tenant relocation is to be achieved. Is that right?
Well, it's evident
just-
that the High Rock and Linden Chambers will be the first before I want to say definitely before High Rock and before Captain Robert Cook. And it just doesn't seem feasible that we would be talking about this Captain Robert Cook before we have discussed the Linden Chambers. I mean, where are they going to reside?
Well, again, I think putting the question to Natalie, I mean, first, I think the High Rock will probably start at the same time or earlier. You're going to get into timing in a couple of slides here. And the secondly is none of this can go forward unless there's a acceptable temporary tenant relocation plan that's been approved by, has plenty of input from the existing tenants that are here, as well as approved by the board.
Yeah, that's a $65 million question, where the tenant's gonna go. So I'm just trying to get some little inclination on, where they're gonna go, just because that's one of the main questions I'm being asked upon.
Sure.
So Reg, just to answer your question, you're right that a tenant relocation plan would need to be created. And as a best practice, residents are involved in the creation of that tenant relocation plan. It is, we're not quite at the place yet to have a strategy for tenant relocation. There's still a design process that would need to be done to understand the scope of work, how it would be phased. But tenant relocation, Janice, is a top priority for the Needham Housing Authority.
But isn't there a process that you can, fall back on? You've done this in the past. This is your baby, right? This is what you do.
Right. So it typically in the past, what we've done at the Cambridge Housing Authority, where tenant relocation has been required, is that there's a resident engagement process around a tenant relocation plan, where there's been different types of, we both discussed the type of relocation that would be necessary, for how long, why it's needed, and then working through what options are available. So it really depends on the resources that are available, but sometimes it can be staying on site during construction. If a phased construction development is possible, it can be moving off site to another housing authority unit, or potentially using a Section 8 voucher to as a relocation resource.
Okay.
And I'll just add that, it's, the only way construction happens is if you come up with a solid, careful relocation plan that ensures that the residents continue to have the type of housing and the affordability of their house in place, so that, they're protected. You have to get that done and in place and established before you can actually move forward with construction.
Yeah, they definitely need some continuity there.
Yeah, no, and that's always a critical part, but I think we're, in terms of, either talking about Linden and Chambers, or talking about High Rock, or Captain Robert Cook, we're not there yet, because we're just at the early phases at Linden and Chambers to start the design. We're just starting the conversation with the architect. We don't know exactly what's going to be proposed, or what the types of phasing is going to be, or even where they might start on the site, and when. So, but we do know it's a real critical element to the ability to actually move forward. And the key piece is to make sure to do it in a way that is respectful of and considerate of the residents, and to do it so that they continue to have an affordable housing home, because it's their home to live in, that we kind of make sure we map that out in consultation with the residents as we move forward.
Well, thank you for your response, Margaret.
All right. I will move on to the next slide unless there are any other questions. See if I can do that. There we go. So essentially, over the past almost a year and a half, what we've been looking at are different repositioning tools that HUD has. And those have been evaluated by Needham Housing Authority staff, by the CHA Development Consulting team. We've taken into consideration the questions and comments that the board has provided during our meetings here. And so what we've done is essentially, and what this presentation will go into is an analysis looking at what the economic benefit is of 2 different repositioning strategies to the Needham Housing Authority. We've talked a little bit about fair cloth units, and I will describe that in greater detail shortly. But essentially, we've looked at the fair cloth units that are generated through repositioning and what their benefit is to, the recapitalization of state properties or the construction of new units at High Rock. We've looked at the repositioning strategies, how you can use the resources that are made available to support the NHA's mission and also meet the guiding principles that I just went through. The timing of the economic benefit, ability to meet eligibility thresholds, and how complex the execution is. So this is kind of in a nutshell what I will go through in the next slides. Are there any questions here?
I think you keep going here for a couple more slides and I'll interrupt you if we go too
Okay.
far here.
Great, thanks, Reg. So what we see here is a table that has 3 strategies. And so there's strategy 1, strategy 1B, and strategy 2. Strategy 1 essentially looks at a RAD Section 18 construction blend for Cook and seabeds combined, and then a Section 18 for High Rock. This was when we had initially come back in November, we'd focus on strategy 1 and strategy 2. Since then, we've received the updated High Rock Estates report. And unfortunately, as I'll describe in a couple of slides, Section 18 has very stringent eligibility requirements related to essentially the critical costs in 1 to 3 years. And High Rock Estates does not seem to meet those requirements. So essentially, strategy 1 is not on the table anymore. So then what we're looking at is at strategy 1B and strategy 2. Strategy 1B is essentially for the 136 units doing a RAD Section 18 blend. And that essentially would result in 20% of those units converting under RAD, which stands for the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. And those RAD rents are based on the existing public housing rents, and so are a little bit lower. And 80% of those units being converted through Section 18, which essentially results in a fair market value rent, which is modeled after the market rents in the area and is therefore much higher. So that's strategy 1B. Strategy 2, on the other hand, is the Section 22 streamlined voluntary conversion. This is something that's available as of right to housing authorities who have a federal public housing portfolio with less than 250 units. So it's available to the Needham Housing Authority. What this does is that it would convert all of the 136 units to that fair market value rent, which is substantially higher than your current public housing rents and also RAD. I think one main thing, we're going to go over this in greater detail over the next 2 slides, is to focus, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but at this bottom number, that's the income after repositioning, what you can see is that 1B, through both the increase in the operating income up here, as well as the additional fair clause subsidy, essentially yields the highest economic benefit to the housing authority. Strategy 2, so that's at 4.5 million, is the total economic benefit of strategy 1B. Strategy 2, on the other hand, is just right after, and it's at an economic benefit of 4 million. There's really 2 main things here that we wanted to just highlight at a higher level, and we'll drill down, is that For strategy 1B, you need to do construction work and get to construction closing in order to get that higher revenue stream. So essentially, we have a timing analysis that suggests that it'll take roughly 7 years to get to that full economic benefit. In that 7 years, though, it's also important to note that you will have essentially have done construction work at your various properties and essentially modernize them. For section 22, the revenue stream essentially kicks in after you've received approval from HUD for the section 22 application and also completed the implementation. We estimate that at a total of time, that's roughly a year to take into account between deciding to go for strategy 2, the section 22, putting together the application, having HUD review it, approvals, then setting up the legal structures needed in order to get that section 22 completely implemented and the revenue streams coming in. The other high level of analysis is we looked at what it would take to essentially be able to fund 10 years of modernization needs. So the 10-year needs at your various properties. Section 1B provides you with a path towards that. That's the yes down there. Strategy 2 does not provide you with enough income or tools in order to meet that.
And will you explain why it doesn't, and on this slide or a future slide?
Margaret, do you want to take that question?
Sure. Let's see how to say it, the use of, so when you look at section 22 by itself and look at the amount of debt you can take on, the amount of debt that you can take on is not enough to actually cover the full cost of the renovations at 3 federal sites. Where if you do the section 18 rad blend, the 1B or the 1A, you're able to combine that with other resources that then, with the Faircloth units that then allow for Needham to move forward with, a strategy that would allow it to fund all of its capital needs at each of the sites. So for instance, at Captain Robert Cook, the 10 years, and I looked just at a 10-year picture, the construction need for 10 years will cost $15.5 million. And the debt that you can support through section 22 is only $10 million. And so you have a $5 million gap. But you could, combine that, if you combine that with other resources, then you're starting to close that gap. And then also being able to create additional revenue that then the Housing Authority can use to further its missions, either at Linden and Chambers in terms of having added resources, or at High Rock Home in terms of increasing the density there by turning the single family homes into duplexes. So the effort I looked at was, if you just did section 22 by itself with nothing else, could you actually complete your kind of base scope of work at each of the 2 sites, Cooks and Seabeds, and then achieve what you've been stated as your goal is for High Rock, which is increased density. And the answer for section 22 by itself with no other kind of enhancement is you can't. But with the RAD section 18, the presumption is that you would move forward with the renovation work there, and take on the other enhancements, which would include the low-income housing tax credit program, so that you would then not only achieve all of what you want to do at Two Beds and Cook, but also generate additional revenue that could be deployed both at Linden and Chambers, but also deployed at, funding a portion of the new duplexes or triplexes at High Rock Homes, if that were the direction the board wanted to go.
Thanks.
Any other questions before we move on to the next slide, which is very related to what we're talking about right now? Why don't we go to the next slide, Natalie, and tell us what that adds to the analysis. Who has their hand up? I'm sorry, I've got little tiny windows. Penny, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, the phrase fair market value, I'm not following that. Does that mean that we would be charging our residents more than we do now? We charge them a third of what their income is, and it's a sliding scale.
Right. So the answer to that is that what the tenants would pay would still be based on 30% of their income. The fair market value is a reference to the total, essentially the total contract subsidy for that unit. So essentially, the amount of subsidy that you would be getting from HUD to operate that building would increase, not the tenant rent.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll just add, that's the same across all three options, that the resident rent is always still based on 30% of the income, and that fair market rent is a HUD term that just sets what the Section 8 contract rent is. But again, it doesn't change how the resident's rent is calculated and what the resident would pay.
Thanks, Margaret. So here on this next slide, we're really looking at the strategy 1B and the strategy 2. This slide here focuses on the increases in the operating income. So essentially what you can see here is that the increase in, you're currently receiving roughly 1.7 million for the 136 units. Strategy 1B, through a combination of new operating income, which is, or the increase in the operating income through the addition of essentially units with rents set at the fair market rent, plus for both options, you would be receiving an administrative fee for the administration of those vouchers. In total, what you're seeing is for strategy 1B, an increase in operating income of 1.8 million. For strategy 2, which provides 100% of the 136 units will be converted under to the higher fair market rent vouchers, you're seeing a higher increase in operating income of 2.2 million. So strategy 1B increases the operating income by 106%. Strategy 2, in terms of just looking at the operating income, increases it by even higher, by 131%. However, what the bottom shows here is the impact of Faircloth. So essentially, Faircloth authority is the amount of public housing units that a public housing authority can own, assist, and operate. The Needham Housing Authority has a Faircloth authority of 136 units. That is exactly the number of units between Cook, Seabeds, and High Rock estates. But essentially, some repositioning tools allow for essentially, when you're moving the unit from the Section 9 platform to the Section 8 platform, it basically opens up the Faircloth authority on the public housing side. And that's for all of the units that are converting under Section 18. So one of the big items for section 22 is that although it does increase the operating income by more than strategy 1B, it doesn't generate any fair cloth units. And that's essentially because one of the requirements of the section 22 program is that the housing authority close the section 9 public housing program. That doesn't mean that the units, the hard units at Cooksey Beds and High Rock Estates go away. It also doesn't mean that those units aren't affordable with that 30% of your income being, the rent being modeled of 30% of your income. What that means is just that your units have transferred over from section 9 to the section 8 platform, and you close, there's no more units in your section 9 platform, and so you close it. For strategy 1B, as we mentioned earlier on, 80% of those units of the 136 would be converted under the section 18 process, which basically means that you would generate 108 fair cloth units. We estimate that the value of a fair cloth unit is roughly $728, which then annually generates an additional $943,000 that can be used as operating subsidy. So I know that that was a lot. I can go deeper into fair cloth units on the next page, or we can take questions now.
Do the commissioners have any questions at this page here? And the next page does go in deeper into fair cloth units as to why they're important. Does everybody remember why fair cloth units exist in the first place?
Yes, it's a 1-to-1.
It was an attempt by Senator Faircloth of North Carolina, one-term senator who was a hog farmer, to prevent any more public housing being built in the United States. And so he got an amendment passed to a spending bill that basically said the number of units, public housing units you had now, federal ones, is the ones you can never have any more than that. And the fair cloth units are units of subsidy. You know, each one can be used to subsidize a unit of public housing. So if we create more units at High Rock, or if we create more units at Linden Chambers, once we do the repositioning, those get freed up and then can be redeployed potentially if we keep them, hang on to them, to either High Rock redevelopment or to Linden Chambers redevelopment. But we only get to keep them if we do strategy 1B. Due to, I guess, who knows why it's set up that way, but it is. That's how I've come to understand it. Have I gotten anything wrong, Natalie?
No, I think that was a very good explanation.
So why don't we go to the next slide if there are no hands up or comments here?
Sounds good.
Covered some of these points, I guess, just now. I did.
Yeah, so some of these items you just discussed, but I think it's helpful to repeat it. So essentially what that fair cloth authority is, it's an additional unit. It's operating subsidy that could help support additional units. So by generating 108 fair cloth units through the conversion, you could essentially support the operations of 108 new units. So that could be used to create new units of affordable housing, or, for example, to provide additional operating subsidies to the state public housing units. And I think it's important to note too that these are deeply affordable. So the question earlier about how tenant rents are set, the tenant rents would be set at 30% of a resident's income. So the 108 units of Faircloth are something that could be, it's a really important and useful tool in terms of assisting with the redevelopment of Linden Chambers or creating new units at High Rock. One thing to note is that those Faircloth units would only be generated after you've reached the construction closing for the 3 different properties. So you'd be getting them over time if that's the strategy that the board chooses to use, strategy 1B, and that the units that receive that Faircloth authority, the operating subsidy, would have to meet the REAC housing quality standards. And one note that we wanted to make was that there have been, periodically attempts to either suspend the Faircloth Amendment or to repeal it in order to allow public housing authorities to increase the number of federally assisted public housing units. But they have not been successful. So the last time that the number this was put into place was the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARA. We have one more slide on the Faircloth units, and then I can stop and we can take more questions. So we wanted to highlight some of the intangibles which relate back to those guiding principles of development that the Needham Housing Authority has. The Faircloth units can help the Needham Housing Authority further its missions and meet the goals of the PRI initiative, specifically by being able to either help fund the redevelopment of the state public housing properties like Linden and Chambers, because there the state operating subsidy is quite low, and there if those are to exit out of the state public housing portfolio, then essentially they would need to find new operating subsidy. Faircloth could be one tool to meet that need. It can also be used to increase the number of units of affordable housing in Needham. So to help the Needham Housing Authority take advantage of the land that it has to build more affordable housing. The last bullet here is that it's essentially one way to think about it is having that 108 units of Faircloth is another tool in the Needham Housing Authority's toolkit. One is that operating subsidy is possibly the hardest subsidy to get in order to help both pay for the operational costs of properties, but also the operating subsidy is really important in terms of being able to take out a permanent mortgage that can help fund the capital needs at properties. And this one, there's limited resources at the state level for operating subsidies. So being able to have that that's controlled by the housing authority is, it essentially allows the housing authority to better control the vision for its portfolio in the future. I think one other important point that's here at the bottom is that it could help to attract more capital subsidy for Needham Housing Authority redevelopment projects. And that's because DHCD has, as part of its funding rounds, on the state public housing side, it has looked to Faircloth units as an important leverage. So DHCD will come in with capital subsidy if the housing authority can show that it is willing to bring some operating subsidy to the table.
Okay, is everybody, do we need to do a seventh inning stretch here? Or does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, let's, so I hear that, that's a really important difference between 1B and 2. Is that with 1B, we continue to hang on to these scarce and, and max, and there aren't making any new of them, ones of them, these public housing Faircloth unit subsidies. And the other one is we give them up, and then we get a bit more money. We get more money if we hang on to them, but I guess just to segue into the next slide, there's a timing issue. So why don't we go on to slide number 11 here?
Sounds good. So, as mentioned earlier on, there's an interesting aspect related to the timing of when these revenue sources come in to play. So for strategy 1B, for the RAD section 18 construction blend, you essentially need to, in order to convert, you need to close on the construction financing and be ready to start construction at the various properties. So essentially there's some time there that's needed to work with an architect to develop the drawings, finalize the funding, get all of the due diligence done, and then start construction. In a nice way, it does dovetail with the Needham Housing Authority's goal of essentially modernizing or redeveloping its property to better serve its residents. All in all, and there's a little chart at the bottom of the next slide, it's expected that it would take 7 years to essentially go through the full repositioning for strategy 1B. And of course, that is subject to the Housing Authority's capacity to proceed with the construction funding, construction projects, and also the availability of additional state or federal funding if needed. But essentially, as I'll show on the next slide, although it's taking a little longer for you to get the full economic benefit of strategy 1B, after 15 years, you'd basically be ahead with strategy 1B than with strategy 2. Strategy 2 does not require, which is the section 22 conversion, it does not require construction for the rents to increase. So essentially, what you should take into account in terms of the timing here is just putting together the application, having HUD review it, and then once you get the HUD approvals, to essentially work out those structural and legal aspects of the implementation. And so we've estimated that time to roughly take a year. And then after that year, the increased revenue would start coming in.
So are you speaking to the next slide in terms of timing?
Yes.
That one, 12.
So
maybe you can use your pointer there to illustrate what you just said and go through it again here.
Of course. So basically, why don't we look here first at the bottom, because this is essentially the timing assumptions that feed into this analysis here. And basically it assumes that, there would be.
Did you lose key?
Sorry. This is the timing assumption for the analysis. So it essentially assumes Cook and Seabed's renovation project starting in the middle of 2024, a Linen Chambers redevelopment in 2025, and then High Rock in 2027. As you look here at the top, which is the analysis itself over time, we've broken it out by 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and 40 years. So this timing assumption in terms of when you would do basically do the construction that's needed in order to get the higher rents would essentially mean that although, as we saw on earlier slides, that strategy 1B has the highest amount of economic revenue for the housing authority, it takes longer for it to kick in. So in 10 years, section 22 would give you a higher economic benefit than strategy 1B by roughly 2.3 million. But in 15 years, you would find that the cumulative gain that you'd received from taking the time of going through strategy 1B and doing the construction work would then roughly equal that of section 22, even though for section 22, you were getting those higher rents earlier on. And then it flips in 20 years. Strategy 1B would essentially give you a higher economic benefit than strategy 2 by roughly 2.6 million. And then that increases for 40 years. So there is, if you're looking for the highest economic benefit right away, section 22 will deliver that. The strategy 1B takes a little longer to get to that higher economic benefit, but in the long term will deliver more of an economic gain to the housing authority. And then there's also the important point that's here in the blue circle, which is this is just numbers and the economics, which is really important, but there's also the important aspect of how it ties back to essentially the guiding principles and the intangibles, which is being able to use these resources to essentially preserve Linden and Chambers and expand the number of affordable housing units in Needham through the use of that, the fair cloth units that are being generated.
Okay, pause time again here. Any comments or questions from the commissioners?
I have a question.
Ed, please.
Does the Cambridge Housing Authority Consulting Group have a recommendation on one or the other of these plans?
I'll jump in and answer that, Natalie, if that's okay. So our recommendation as an agency and as a consulting team would be to do 1B, which is that section 18 RAD blend. Because when we look at your entire portfolio, not only your federal portfolio, but the urgent need to upgrade your state portfolio, the path that allows for improvements both on the federal side and on the state side is really contingent on those fair cloth units, because they add the element of being able to keep the units at Linden and Chambers deeply affordable, but provide the housing authority with sufficient revenue to actually successfully operate them. And then they open the door, one of the possibilities at Linden is, to replace the bungalow style units, the 72 units with twice as many units. So you'd be at 124 units. And with the fair cloth units, you're not only able to keep the original 72 deeply affordable, but you have a path to make the balance of the new units 72 potentially deeply affordable, or at least more of them deeply affordable than you would absent the fair cloth. And so we see it as a whole portfolio-wide solution that would allow Needham Housing Authority to not only add the revenue to the federal portfolio, but to use some of those added resources and these fair cloth units to really stabilize this and expand what at Linden and Chambers and most likely at High Rock Homes as well.
Thank you. That was a very understandable explanation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions from commissioners on this? This is one of our sort of critical decision points, you know, differentials here. As I heard you, what you said, Margaret, is I'm not sure we really completely did this on purpose when we set forth to do the facilities master plan in 2018, but one result of looking at it when we had the advocates team to come in and then looking at how we would what we would do with the entire you know, nearly 42 acres that we have of land and developments, you know, all is that had we not taken that overall kind of comprehensive look, which has led us to this meeting here, we might have gone down the road of doing the repositioning without thinking about Linden Chambers and your example there, and said, oh, well, that bird in the hand of more cash is worth two in the bush, future, you know, result 15 years down the road, something like that. Is that right? Or did I just muddy up your nice explanation that Ed, and you're on mute there, but Ed just complimented you on here.
You know, it really does increase the flexibility for Needham Housing Authority and really adds, you know, to your toolbox around, you know, creating and expand, you know, creating, protecting and expanding your affordable housing. And, you know, key to me has always been, you know, kind of what Penny raised, which is making sure the units are affordable. Because sometimes what happens, you know, and this happens in Cambridge with inclusionary units, I think that's something that has had some airplay in Needham, where, you know, the developer gets a break on density if they provide inclusionary units, but they're only affordable to people who are higher or lower income, and they have to have enough income to be able to support a $1,500, $1,600 or $1,800 rent. And there are low income households that can, but they tend to be folks who are at, you know, 55 or 60% of area median income. And when you look at the folks that are on typically the folks that are on the Housing Authority's waiting list, they're folks that are at or below 30% of area median income, where they're only able to pay, you know, somewhere between $400 and $600 or $700 a month in rent. And what the Faircloth units do is they give the Housing Authority the difference to be able to support that family in an affordable housing unit, but still keep the lights on and pay the bills. Where, you know, if you go down the path and you don't have those resources available, then potentially all you're creating at Linden and Chambers is that kind of very thin housing that only a handful of elders who fall into that 50 to 60% of area median income can afford. And again, you know, that's about $60,000 of income a year. And that doesn't match who's on your waiting list.
Beg your pardon?
We're playing around with numbers.
Okay. Yeah, please, Steve, why don't you wait?
Margaret, I gotta push back a little bit. You're talking about saving 108 Faircloth units. There are 152 units at Linden Chambers. So we're losing subsidy there if you give it all back, if you give the state program back. Right now, they're all subsidized under the state program, and we're letting the state off the hook for that, but we're not really subsidizing the full number of units. And if we add units, we don't have subsidy for those units. So I think we're to say that 108 units of Faircloth are going to help us expand the number of public housing. I think that's a little bit misleading. I don't think that's quite accurate. It would certainly take care of 108 units here at or here that would have to have some type of subsidy behind. And the Faircloth units go into the federal public housing system, so we're back in that until we reposition those units. Is that correct?
You would, the way that HUD has set up the Faircloth program now is that they have a streamlined path from new public housing units directly to RAD. So they would come on as public housing units almost, for a very short period of time, a day or two, just enough to be in the PIC program, and then they would convert to RAD so that they would be run as RAD units, so you wouldn't have to go through a repositioning after the fact. And that's that then allows you to actually take debt on those units, since you can't take debt on traditionally public housing units. But what we would do, and I didn't look at Chambers in my exercise that I did yesterday, but I looked just at the 72 units at Linden, and looked at the plan that was done in 2012 and 13, or 13 and 14, I forget the years exactly, where they showed the potential of 128 units on the Linden site, so holding Chambers aside. And in that instance, what I did was put the 60 Faircloth units in place. I added, the potential use of 20 Section 8 vouchers, a combination of some vouchers from the Needham Housing Authority, but some 8 vouchers from DHCD. So and then kept the 12 units still affordable without a subsidy, and then did a combination, a small number of low-income housing tax credit rents, and then a number that would be, marketed to Section 8 mobile voucher holders. And you end up with having enough gross potential rent to keep all 128 of them affordable, with only 18 of them being in that band of just low-income housing tax credits, where you have to have that higher income. And so you're able to, you're not able to get 100% of them deeply affordable, but you're really targeting 110% as 110 units as deeply affordable. And you're still leaving for the future, the site, the chamber site would still under this scenario for the time being would still be 80 units of state public housing as we work through a plan there. But it basically, creates a path that didn't exist before for the 128 units that was envisioned back in the 2013 plan to potentially move forward. Where, absent the 60 Faircloth units, the DHCD, the amount of money DHCD gives you to operate state public housing really is not sufficient to cover the actual cost of running it. And it's certainly well below what the industry standard is. And I'm sure the board knows from the budgets that they approved the difference on your per unit operating cost for seabeds as elderly housing on the federal side versus your operating costs for Linden and Chambers, and I would imagine there's several $1,000s a year difference in what you're able to fund through the federal program, which is much closer, still a little below, but much closer to what is typical in the market for the cost of elderly housing, where the state program is really has been and continues to be inadequately funded, both from a operational side, but also from a capital side.
Do you want to continue to comment, or shall we move on? Yeah, I mean, I will comment. I think there are very active discussions going on between, all the people are focusing on this, and it's not easy to come to what the right conclusion is. When I witnessed some of this earlier, I said, I think the board may be interested in continuing, our full-time professionals to continue to work these issues so that maybe we can get closer to a consensus recommendation here. So why don't we move on? I'm just watching the clock here because we're getting a little late, Natalie. So why don't we see if we can pick it up with some of these other issues. Again, just to set the stage for the board, maybe I don't know if I said this at the beginning, maybe not. But the purpose of this meeting is to give the board an update on the very substantial progress that's been made, but also recognize that we haven't sat and gone through these issues for, it may be more than a year. And so kind of getting these all reloaded into our frontal lobes, is going to take more than one session here, more than this session. So go ahead, Natalie, pick up on the other issues besides the timing, what we've just discussed. What are the other issues that we're going to have to pay attention to here?
Sure. So one aspect is the ability to meet eligibility thresholds. And I think, I mean, this is why we've essentially selected strategy 1B and 2 to present, because you can meet those. We wanted to include here the eligibility thresholds for strategy 1, just to explain why that wasn't further, I mean, why it wasn't proposed at tonight's board meeting. And that's really related to where my cursor is right now. There is section 18, which initially we were considering for High Rock, hoping that it would meet it, but it has very stringent eligibility thresholds in terms of meeting the requirements for that program. And it's essentially, there are not enough construction needs and the right construction needs in order to pass that test. And it's one that can be very difficult to have HUD approve. And so we do not recommend moving forward with strategy 1. That's why I have this very fancy red mark over it. Instead, the focus is really on strategy 1B, the portfolio-wide RAD section 18 construction blend, and section 22. The key eligibility thresholds to keep in mind here is that, as we mentioned before, construction needs to occur in order for, if the Needham Housing Authority Board chooses to proceed with strategy 1B, construction would need to occur. And in order to meet the requirements for strategy 1B, you would ideally want to be at 90% of the hard construction cost level set by HUD. So essentially the way that this is met is we've looked at the property conditions report to get a sense of what the capital needs are at the property, but that test gets to be met as you've decided the scope of work for the project. So essentially you will need to do construction and it will need to meet a per unit cost that we think it is possible for High Rock Estates to meet, Captain Cook to meet. Seabeds is a little tougher because there was substantial envelope work already done at the property, but there is a path to meeting this threshold by bundling Cook and Seabed. So essentially it will be one construction project done together, which is also advantageous. They're adjacent to one another. It could help with relocation questions, and also builds an economy of scale. So that's strategy 1B. For strategy 2, essentially this is available to the Needham Housing Authority as of right, because you have less than 250 units of public housing, federal public housing. This is somewhat related, but it's just related to more focusing in on the manageability or the complexity of execution for strategy 1B and strategy 2. And here there are some interesting nuances on both sides. Strategy 1B requires construction in order for the new revenue to start. And as part of that construction, you would likely be funding it through a permanent mortgage that is taken out, but also through the 4% low-income housing tax credit program. And so funders that are providing loans and also equity through the low-income housing tax credit program, they will evaluate the housing authority in terms of staff capacity, organizational stability and governance, financial capacity, your balance sheet, and also if you have prior experience with the low-income housing tax credit project. And so it is likely that if you do want to do a construction project, that you will have to partner with another group that has more experience with the low-income housing tax credit program, and also a balance sheet that is able to meet stringent requirements related to liquidity and guarantees. So we have a slide coming up that talks a little bit about the pros and cons of partnering with such a developer. But one thing that I wanted to note is that while this is in the strategy 1B column, this applies to any Needham Housing Authority construction project that has loans and low-income housing tax credits. So that could be Linden Chambers, the redevelopment there, or even if you do choose to move forward with strategy 2 and in the down the line, you want to modernize your properties, you will have to, likely consider working with someone. So that is strategy 1B. On strategy 2, as we saw on the previous slide, it's an as of right approval given the size of the federal public housing portfolio in Needham. But there are two interesting parts here to highlight. One is, as I mentioned earlier, that as part of Section 22, you would need to close out the Section 9 program at the Needham Housing Authority. That just means that you'd be giving up any Faircloth units, but also if in the future there are any additional or new public housing initiatives, the Needham Housing Authority would not be able to access those through the Section 9 program because it would no longer exist. The other part here is that, so the repositioning is essentially moving the units from Section 9 to the Section 8 voucher platform. In the case of strategy 2, Section 22, those vouchers are they're tenant based instead of being project based. And that essentially means that they act somewhat similarly to mobile voucher. A household gets the voucher and they can choose to project base it at their unit at Cook Seabeds or High Rock, or they could potentially, if they wanted to take that voucher and move to another part of the state or another property, they could do that. So it's a manageable risk, and that is what this next slide goes over. So essentially the big question is, because you're relying on those vouchers, right, to meet the operational costs at your property and to also help potentially pay for any modernization. So what happens if you choose to proceed with Section 22 and households, a smaller number of households decide not to project base their vouchers, but instead move from the property with their tenant-based voucher? So the key note here is to take home is that this is a manageable risk, and there's a lot of different solutions that can be used and have been used successfully at other housing authorities. One is if there are any vouchers in your current Section 8 mobile voucher pool, you can essentially, you have the right to project base up to 20% of your mobile vouchers. So you could take a voucher from that pool and project base it in that unit. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is that you would market and rent that unit to households with mobile Section 8 vouchers. And then if it turns out that the person you're renting it to doesn't have a mobile Section 8 voucher, you don't have any available Section 8 vouchers in your voucher pool, then essentially the housing authority would need to carry the costs of operating the unit, which we did just as an example, and it's a rough example. If 10% of the residents, 14 households, were to leave with their vouchers, it depends a little bit on whether or not it's more seniors or families who choose to move with their Section 8 voucher. But ultimately, if you look at, because there's an attrition rate in your Section 8 voucher pool, up until the point where you would essentially have enough vouchers in your voucher pool to be able to backfill those units, the housing authority would be covering costs of approximately 78,000 to 94,000, which may seem like a big sum on this page, but essentially you have to see it in the total picture of the amount of revenue that's being generated by this repositioning strategy. So the big picture here is that it is a risk that the board should be aware of, but it is a manageable one that housing authorities have been able to address in a variety of ways.
Okay, any questions comments on that one? We've gone through this before, and hopefully this is bringing back memories of previous discussions here. Okay, why don't we move on, Natalie?
Sure. So this was related to the complexity of execution for strategy 1B, but does apply to any modernization project that the Needham Housing Authority may take on. And so what we wanted to provide here was just an overview of what are some of the benefits and what are some of the drawbacks of partnering with a developer in order to be able to meet the requirements that lenders and low-income housing tax credit investors have. So as you can see, there are a lot of pros, there's a lot of cons. Ultimately, relationships depend a little bit from partner to partner, and the agreement that you negotiate, but essentially some of the pros and why housing authorities at times partner with developers is that they have a larger balance sheet that can be used to meet underwriting requirements. So that's liquidity and net worth that the financial partners look for in order to be able to make sure that you can meet construction completion and other guarantees. They also have the LIHTC and affordable housing experience that a lot of funders look for. You would essentially be sharing some of the risk that is associated with a construction project. And as mentioned earlier, meet those guarantee requirements around completing constructions and leasing the property back up after construction is complete. There is a potential of cost sharing some of the pre-development expenses for a project. Developers often too have relationships with various parties that they can draw on. That can be lenders and investors that they worked with before, or architects and general contractors. Some of the developers will have different areas of expertise. So there's, developers that have more of a focus on green design or resident services. And essentially what it does is it addresses some of the issues around staff of a small PHA and governance. The cons are essentially what you pay for those resources. And that is, as a big picture, is that the financial benefit of the project, which can be developer fee, cash flow, is essentially shared between the housing authority and the developer. A big one is that often larger developers will want to also manage the units. So it may result in a change in management agent, which means different management practices, intake procedures, policies, and ultimately the loss of management fees to the housing authority. It may also, in some cases, result in a change of ownership of the units or long-term control of the property. And then there's a sharing of decision-making. So, around management, the design and the goals for the project, who you're working with as financial partners. And I just wanted to kind of wrap this up by saying that it is on a spectrum, and ultimately the more resources that you have, the more you can negotiate and leverage. And in that sense, having operating subsidy that you can provide is essentially a good way of, it's a good tool to use to be able to leverage having more control from the housing authority side.
Any
Thank you.
questions on that one? All right, we're on the home stretch. We're on the last slide, I think.
All right, so next steps. No easy steps, but a lot of opportunity here. So we wanted to highlight that we understand that this is a lot of material to sift through, and that one of the next step is for the board and also NHA staff to have a discussion around how you want to proceed with decision making. If there's more time that's needed, if there's a particular way that, for example, if there's a retreat that could be helpful or additional material. As part of this presentation, we're collecting your questions and feedback, and we will address those. I think that's kind of the big immediate next step, is how to figure out the decision making, then making the decision itself. And once that decision has been made, there's a process of putting together the applications and submitting those to HUD. As I mentioned right at the start, very excitingly, the Linden Chambers A&E Designer Services will kick off next week. So essentially, over the next 18 months, there will be a process of working with the A&E team on doing a master plan for Linden and Chambers, understanding what the opportunities are there, getting it zoned, and then moving towards construction on a first phase. If strategy 1B is pursued, you would also have to work on putting together a request for a proposal for an A&E, the architectural and engineering designer services for cook and seabeds. The expectation is to reissue the legal services request for proposal early this year. They'll be a critical part of any team or a team for any of the two repositioning strategies. The NHA is currently pursuing the approval of additional CPA funding applications to cover pre-development costs at Linden and Chambers, as well as seabeds and Cook. And then we're looking towards a potential start of a Linden Phase 1 construction project in Q2 of 2024.
The end. Okay. I'm again mindful that we're creeping up on 9:30 here, and it's an awful lot of information that we've talked about. My computer failed. We had an emergency electrical contact to the iPhone that's maintaining the internet connection here. I think we dodged that bullet here. It's not been a good technical night. Does any board members have any thoughts or comments on what they would desire to, how they desire to proceed from here as we're getting closer to needing to make this decision, which ultimately is a board decision? We've got to listen to all the experts, hear all the different points of view, thing that's going to come through that we can decide on here. But ultimately, we have the fiduciary responsibility to make the decision. Not tonight, but what does anybody have any feelings on how we should proceed from here that would help us understand what we're trying to make a decision about? Penny, you have your hand up. It appears there.
Well, I'd be inclined to take the advice of our consultants. You're suggesting the first one.
Mm.
I just want
Lower,
to,
but
I just want to
Okay,
Yep. And
I just, if I can chime in,
Let's let Penny finish and then Jen next and then Eleanor after that.
well, I was trying to get next
Yeah, I
steps
see
off my
Penny's finished,
screen.
right? Go ahead. Oh,
Can't.
can you take the, yeah, thank you. Yeah, good. Did you have another comment, Janice, or should I go to Eleanor here?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I thought she did a great overview of what we've been discussing, over the past, I want to say 8, 9 months. And I think it's brought us closer to a decision of what we should do and what we shouldn't do. But that doesn't mean that, we are all gonna be on the same page, so, I think as a board, we may wanna, open this up for a discussion, at a later date and possibly get a few residents involved.
Okay,
That was gonna be my comment is what, I mean, that seems like there should be some resident input along the way here before we make a decision as a board.
okay.
And I know that in the, when was it, in the fall or so, at some point along the way, there was, I know that Cambridge Housing Authority did sessions with, one or more sessions with residents, so just wondered what you folks would recommend in terms of, I mean, I know that residents could, either some have and others could watch this meeting, but is there, you know, how would you recommend presenting this information? for residents?
If you're asking me, Eleanor, I would suggest, as the resident commissioner, possibly a resident survey, to go out, probably immediately, if not sooner, just because of the fact that a lot of the residents over at the Linden Chambers area and, more than likely up at Seabeds and, the people that, really of lowest income do not have the capability of coming online to, absorb all of the content that we just got. So, yeah, and so I'll just pose that question to you, Steve, on how we go about that.
I would think it's a smart decision to try to do some type of survey. And to have a couple more public meetings. Just that
With the
reason.
residents,
That's right, yeah, that's what I meant, I'd say public with the residents.
because it's their housing, and we gotta respect what they, what they're thinking, I just got, don't laugh, but I'm laughing, in 10 years, we're looking at 10 years and who knows where we're gonna be in 10 years. So I think the residents that are gonna be here in 10 years deserve to, be in on that decision-making process.
And I just want to add that irrespective of whether you choose 1B or 2, before the application were to get submitted to HUD, there actually is a robust resident process required in terms of explaining to the residents why and what the housing authority is proposing to do. And the application itself, the housing authority would have to vote a second time for it to go forward so that you would have the input from the residents through that process. But both options are proposing to switch the housing authority's federal public housing program to the Section 8 voucher program. It's just a question of whether or not you do it in a way that maximizes near-term your revenue, or do it in a way that protects, potentially those fair cloth units so that you could use them potentially elsewhere. But both of those options are switching the portfolio to Section 8, which was all, that's what repositioning is about. But before any application were to be submitted, the board would have to vote a second time to actually approve the physical application. And that would only happen after you went, the housing authority with our assistance would go through a really robust resident process that would not only send letters out to each individual family, but also require public hearings with public comments and agency responses, all of which actually form the basis of your application into HUD, whether it's 1B or 2.
And that's a good response, Margaret, because I just want to say, right now, Captain Robert Cook Drive residents would not anywhere near pass a Section 8 inspection. No way in hell.
Right, and one of the things that the RAD blended application does would be, to put Captain Robert Cook on a path to actually renovating the buildings and addressing some of the deficiencies that residents probably are unhappy about or complaining about it or experiencing, and give the housing authority the opportunity to really refresh those units. And that, the RAD program in particular requires that element to be addressed in the financing. You only can do RAD if you can prove that you're taking care of the next, you have to identify the needs over 20 years, and then you have to have a plan of how you're going to fund those needs. And and what it does, I think, and I've seen, it takes some of the uncertainty about when the renovations are actually going to occur. Because right now, HUD doesn't give enough money for housing authorities to do everything that needs to be done. And everybody always has to wait. And then meanwhile, other things happen. And what RAD has done is really kind of replace that model. One, do the refresh right up front, and two, provide the funding to actually keep current with the renovations that are required when they're required. But you don't move forward with either 1B or 2 without a really robust resident process. But it would be helpful, I think, when we're going out and starting that resident process, to have some guidance from the board about, and I call it the intangible, because, and I think Reg said this that if you just looked initially at the dollars and cents, the Section 22 option is strong because it gives you immediate money. But if you're looking at trying to come up with a plan that's going to address the capital needs, at your federal sites, but also open up the opportunity to address the capital needs at your state site and potentially expand the number of affordable housing units, that's the attraction of 1B. And when we finished, and we've spent a lot of time talking internally at the CHA, a lot of time talking to NHA staff and to try to balance the different options. But it's that ability to move forward your entire portfolio that was really the compelling basis of why we recommend 1B. But the resident process is key, and you can't move forward without it. It's just, I think, going to be helpful, and again, not to be decided today, to have some clear indication from the board, their preference, so that when we have that, you're moving, it would be imprudent, I think, of the housing authority not to take advantage of repositioning, because it does open up so many new resources, either one to the agency. And so then it's just a question of which one should we be talking about? And we can actually do that explanation of, we looked at both of these options, the board has a preference for this one for all of these reasons, and then come back to you with that information, but having some sense of where you as a you as a board want to go, I think would be important to the resident process moving forward.
Thank you.
Eleanor, I see you've got a comment there.
So yeah, one question is there any timeline or does HUD have any deadlines for these applications or this application?
So the RAD program has a statutory requirement of, they can't, unless Congress votes again, they can't exceed like 465,000 units, but they're nowhere near there. So as long as and then I think it's a demonstration, so it sunsets sometime in 2024. But I believe as long as your application is in prior to that date, then they would continue to process your application. Or Congress would actually renew the program because it has been so successful. It really has been a catalyst for many housing authorities to really address some of the longstanding capital work that's been left unaddressed for a long time. So it's, when you go on the website and you look at, what it's funded over, you can click on it and look at it state by state level, but you can look at it nationally, and it's pretty, absent RAD, these units, wouldn't have gotten the capital work they need. And if they don't, eventually, if you don't invest in the capital work, you really put the inventory at risk. I mean, we see that, I think, particularly in state public housing in a lot of locations in Massachusetts.
Ed, I see you have your hands up for a comment or a question.
Yes, we've had some wonderful discussion here, a lot of information, a great explanation. And we've heard most of this before, but I still haven't totally mastered it. So my request is, could we have copies of these slides?
Yeah, we'll send them out right after this meeting. And that's a great question. So slides out. Any other comments and questions? I'm going to try to knit this all together as guidance to our consulting team and to Steve and Cheryl. Okay, ready for this? Okay, so we've got a number of next steps that the board's talked about. I'm going to try to rattle them off here quickly and have Cheryl do her magic and produce it into some sort of coherent set of minutes that we can review here. But I hear definitely having some sort of retreat or having some sort of another meeting where, just a single purpose meeting where we can spend time on it. Maybe not as late as what we're doing right now when we're fresh. We used to do retreats in past initiatives, like on a Saturday. We'd pick a Saturday morning and everybody's fresh. We got some good breakfast. So I just think about this. I'm looking at the team here. Definitely resident input is important. What I heard, I think that discussion is, sure, there's going to be plenty of resident input when we're actually submitting the application that has to be documented. But we need to do a preliminary set of resident input stuff, because we don't want to get to that point and then have all heck break out. At that point, we want to basically be, hopefully as a community, as much on the same page as we can. So that might involve this resident survey. I also from earlier wrote down that we would like to, as a board, to encourage our CHA team and our executive directorship team to drive more towards a consensus recommendation here, and hash out the pros and cons and so forth, and see if we can rely on that as a board. We still have to judge it as a board. Does this make sense to us? But it would be helpful for that. I've got a couple extra questions here. Public, yes, go ahead.
I just want to comment on the last one, just
Mhm.
so everybody's aware of it. First off, I would first say that Margaret and I have worked together for over 30 years ago, and for a long time. She's one of the smartest people in public housing in the country. And working with her and Natalie and Joe is a real positive movement. We have had our disagreements in the past. We have a little bit of disagreement here at this point, but we are working towards, if this is my face tonight, I would say go with option 2, but that doesn't mean that's where it'll be in a month, because we are working towards some of those questions. But that's how I see it, as not only as your director, but as a longtime Needham resident. So I think that retreat idea is as important, not only for the facts of how it would be developed, but what the Housing Authority Board sees as the future of public housing in Needham, and what the market and what the advantages are, because some of the advantages, and I don't want to get into the argument too deep, but there's been a whole lot of support from the community for this effort. There's been millions of dollars put into this effort already. And it's a big decision. And I think the last page, when you talk about developers, really grates on those of us in my position, because of all the commitment that has been made by the local community, by the legislature. And I'm not ready to say that commitment wouldn't go forward, so that if there's opportunities in the future to build housing that we wouldn't have, possibility of CPA money or other other earmarks. So there's a lot to work through here. You know, I know the advantage of this community. They talk about potential vacancies, because actually in the, under option 2, we would have to interview every single resident about what they would want to do as far as getting a voucher. It's a long process. But to be very honest with you, I think 10% leaving Needham would be a large number, because it's one of the more desirable communities in Eastern Massachusetts. And we have people, you know, certainly would love to get their children educated in the Needham public schools. So there's a lot to talk about. I don't think that,
Well, let me jump in here and say, I've listened to this.
Yeah.
Many more hours of this than we've had tonight. And absolutely what Steve says is true. Margaret's smiling as well. And these, you know, these are complicated decisions, and you can have different opinions. And those opinions have been changing and shifting over time. I will say also, we haven't said this tonight, but we're talking about those kind of things. But we're talking about two choices between very good and very, very good. You know, we're arguing about whether you add another very to one or the other one, so that we ought to pick that. But these, we don't have any bad choices there. You know, this is an amazing, you know, having a couple $1 million either way coming in per year overnight, or maybe it takes a few more months or years. I mean, that's a huge, really important story. You can't lose sight of that. So let me keep summarizing so I can see if I can get this meeting ending. If everybody will give me the permission not to make too many more final statements. I heard the what is the urgency question from Eleanor, and the answer from Margaret that says there's an overall cap of 465,000 units, but we're nowhere near that. So, you know, maybe the program needs to be renewed in 2024, but you know, we're well before that. But I would say Jason, the point I just made, to me, there is a lot of urgency. You know, turning on $2 million a year of additional subsidy, you know, sooner rather than later. You know, I don't think we should be thinking about a time frame we're waiting around for the rest of the year to make this decision. I think we need to make a decision in the next, you know, month or short period of time, because that's real money that we don't have and we can use to do a lot of good.
Right,
Right.
I
and just
thought
to
we were
clarify,
doing that tonight.
just to clarify, I wasn't indicating or
I know,
implying that
I
there was
know.
any lack of urgency. I just
Yeah,
wanted to
yeah.
know, you know, is there like a deadline in March or in May,
Right.
you know, something like
Right.
that?
Now, I'm piggybacking on saying, to me, there's a deadline just to, you know, we are very close. And that leads me to two last things to ask our team here, which is to Margaret or Natalie, whoever. Are there any more tasks or studies or anything else that need to be done besides what we've already talked about that stand in the way of being able to submit these repositioning applications? For example, I know we haven't quite finished the High Rock Homes property conditions report. We've still got some more to go there. We're in draft number 2, heading towards the final draft. But is there anything else we need to do at this point to have all the information we need to make a decision? Either Margaret or Natalie.
I can't think of anything.
I agree with that. I think we're in a good place.
You know, it would just be anything that the board might think would be helpful in terms of,
Super. So well, that leads me to that last point that I want to ask about. And Ed, I give you full credit for making me think about this point, which I haven't asked about for a while. And this is not a rehearsed question, but there was this terrific paper, white paper, you know, the repositioning paper, you know, about 15 months ago that was generated, and we had our first, you know, training sessions and so forth. And there was a second draft of that generated, I think it was in January 2022. And yes, this PowerPoint is terrific. And yeah, we can go back and spend a couple hours listening to the recording. But what is there a plan to generate a final draft of that paper that boils everything down from the 4 or 5 options we had there down to options 1B or strategies 1B and 2, and updates the pros and cons in a written form. So, you know, the people like me who've lost a few brain cells over the years, you know, can read it over and over again and make notes in the, you know, and so forth. So we have that document updated to the final version. Can we do, do we have that in the plan to do that anytime soon?
So Reg, we did have the addition to the report that was created, and essentially sought to do just that. When we put it together, really focused on the strategy 1 and strategy 2. And I think what we can do is update it so that it's strategy 1B and strategy 2, and we'll include more of the feedback that we've gotten as part of this presentation.
Because I see that as a useful tool, not only for us to study and do our homework, but it writes down, in essence, what has been said here tonight. So we can come back to it and look at, you know, refresh our memories. And then I think it's a very good tool for going back out to the public or other. I know we're going to have hearings before the CPC and the FinCom and the Select Board, and a lot of people who really want to see that kind of substance in the form of that white paper. And it isn't enough to just be doing PowerPoint analysis and decision making here. So let's definitely take that as an input as well and decide when we can generate that final draft of that paper and tie that into how we follow up on all these other to-dos there's, you know, coming out of here. Have I overlooked anybody's suggestions on how to proceed from here? Well, I'm really appreciative, of course, to the board for giving it this time and energy over these last. I really would like to thank to Natalie and Margaret and Joe and the team that support them, and also Steve and Cheryl have been actually going to bi-weekly meetings and supporting all these analyses in between. And Gary isn't here as well, but there's been an enormous amount of input that Gary has orchestrated without complaint to make it possible for all this analysis to be done by the Cambridge team. And I just, on behalf of the board and the residents, the town, I'd just like to say thank you very much. That was bravo. So everybody else is clapping on mute. Let the record show. And I think it's time to entertain a motion to adjourn from somebody who's not on mute.
I move to adjourn.
Okay, Penny
Second it.
moves to adjourn and
I have
Ed
a
Scheidler
question.
second. You have a question, go ahead. You want to
Yeah,
debate the motion?
where are we at? Where are we at on the new ED? Where are we going?
We passed a motion. It'll be in the minutes to schedule an interview and a discussion and a decision on the next agenda, next board meeting, which is on the 19th of January.
So will we have a meeting prior to that to discuss anything? I'm just curious.
Yeah, we
Is
don't
anyone
have
open to
anything
that?
on the. So
Is
we
anyone
don't have.
needing any more information or any update or?
We're gonna resend out the recommendation packet, you know. And we discussed all that at the beginning here, so.
Reg,
That's what
you
we're
are
gonna
so
do.
slurred. You're
Okay,
speaking
so I'm
like
gonna
it's
call
coming
the roll
across.
as we have to in this virtual meeting. Penny Kirk. I'm
Oh,
sorry
aye.
because we've had a technical meltdown in here. We're barely alive. So you vote, Penny,
Aye.
what?
Aye.
I, Ed, your
Aye.
vote is, Ed Scheidler votes, and Janice Bennett votes.
Aye.
And Eleanor Evans votes.
Aye.
Reg Foster votes to approve the motion to adjourn, and we are adjourned. Thank you very much,
Okay,
everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you,
Have a nice
Thank you
Cambridge
so
evening.
people.
much. Have a
Happy
good
New
evening.
Year.
Good job.
Bye.
Thanks, Cambridge.